I wanted to share my story because I felt that it was important that you all understand who I am. I also wanted you to understand how important that your story is. Some people say, let's not live in the past. Let's forget the past. What people fail to realize is that your past is your story. Your past is what made you today. Okay? So, it really pretty much started when I lost my mother. I was like about 10 years old, and she was killed by her husband. And I lived with my grandparents for a little bit, and then went to go live with my father. And that's one of the points that started me to understand more about Christianity. You see, the person I was then, I didn't understand. I had to take my shoes off. My shoes are killing me. I knew, even as a 10-year-old or 11-year-old, that I'm not a perfect person. I do make mistakes. But I was learning more and more about Christianity. But at the same time, I was learning more and more about grief. I was trying to understand grief, because that was such a tremendous loss of losing my mother that I had a hard time getting over it. And although there were people all the way around me that kept saying, get over it, I couldn't. I just couldn't. And I'm going to sit down for a moment because my back is killing me. So I want to put Lizzie up here. I was grieving still for my mother, even after a year after she passed. But I could not express that grief or that sorrow because I was living with relatives that simply got over it. But I couldn't. My mother to me was special. She meant the world to me like it would mean to you. And the fact that she was killed and she died alone is what bothered me. And as I grew up and got older, I began to realize the story of how death became different every time somebody told me. I was strange. Why would you tell me one way and you tell me another way, and yet you told me something else? It all just didn't make sense. And I think that's what made the grief even harder. Because, nobody was willing to tell the truth. Everybody was more interested in just helping me try to get over it. But I couldn't get over it. And I even had a hard time moving forward with it. In my adulthood life, it was terrible. My depression in my late teens and my early 20s, I was really dealing with a lot of depression. I was dealing with isolation. I felt like I was dealing with abandonment. I was confused. I was alone. I didn't know where I was supposed to go. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. But somehow, through all that, God somehow directed me. Somehow put me on a path. And as I went through my 20s, the things I had to deal with, church friends, roommates, jobs, whatever it was, I had difficulty of coping with it. And I had difficulty of coping with it because I was never taught how to cope with it. And then in my late 20s, I had Timothy, my son. And I still struggled. I struggled with job. I struggled financially. I struggled with relationships. The one relationship with this one guy I was so in love with and wanted so bad to be part of our lives together. And I just know I blew it. I just know I blew it. And I know that I can be accountable of my own actions and my own behaviors, and knowing that I blew it. I blew a wonderful relationship. But even though I blew it, God still had another plan for me. God still wanted me to be directed to a different place. And the interesting is, right before that relationship, I almost got married to another guy. And that was a disaster. And it was like 2 weeks before the wedding, I canceled it. There was no way I was going to marry a man like my father. You see, after my mother died and I went to live with my father, and even though he got married again, the relationship felt like it was abusive. Physical, emotional, spiritual abuse. It was terrible. And just the idea of going away to an academy, it was the idea thing of escaping from my father. I had to. I needed to. You know, and all through those years, the one person who kept on me was my grandmother. And my grandmother kept saying to all of us, I'm praying for you. I'm praying for you. And yet, I struggled. But yet, why I struggled, God somehow still put me on the path that He knew where He was going to direct me. But you see, even if God was doing His part, I was not doing my part. And in order for God to accomplish His goals for me, I had to do my part. It's very difficult. And when you're not really a born-again Christian, if you don't have that conversion, you will continue to struggle. But I'm telling you, even we as Christians who are dedicated our lives to God, even we go through the struggles and depressions. And my depression took hold of me, took control of me. And the sad part about it is I did not know how to stop it. And I needed to stop this. I needed to stop this disaster, this anxiety, this chaos. And it wasn't until even years after Timothy was diagnosed with the muscular dystrophy, and the years that he and I had to struggle on our own. Yes, we had little support, but we did not have the support that we deserved. I think it was right before Timothy passed away in 2014. I think that really was that wake-up call for me and for Tim. It was that wake-up call. It was the wake-up call that we both needed. It was at least 6 to 8, maybe a year before he passed. And that's when I began to realize I could not allow this depression to control me. I could not allow to be stuck in that environment of being that person. I had to be me with Timothy. I had to have that connection with God to make life well worth it. And it wasn't until we had that connection with God that things began to turn around. And then in 2014, suddenly, out of the blue, I have appendicitis. And in that surgery of taking that appendix out, we discovered I had cancer. I had cancer. And meanwhile, my son is at home with some nurses that needed that family support to be there. And I couldn't even get my sister to stay still because it seemed like her business was more important than our lives. I was in a hospital for a month. I had serious surgery, open wounds, and yet my son was struggling to live. He was struggling to live, and I did not know it. And when I realized the cameras no longer was working, I had to make my doctor discharge me because I could not allow him to be at home without me being there. I needed that time to be with him. And little did I know that was going to be my last time with him. And the last week, he was going to his doctor's appointment. I charged his wheelchair, I charged the ventilator, I charged the battery for the ventilator. I charged everything the night before. There was green light everywhere. And I remember we getting him up into the chair, and he looked like he had gained weight. And I remember taking a picture of him and teasing him about it. And then we went to his first doctor's appointment, and suddenly out of the blue, the ventilator was acting up, and then the wheelchair started to act up. And before I know it, the wheelchair quit, the ventilator quit, the battery to the wheelchair quit. How is this possible? I just charged it. How is this possible? I just charged it the night before. How can it be dying on him right now? We had to call 911 when we realized that he needed to be bagged. Couldn't breathe. And it was the fear of at that moment that I thought I had lost my son. And we got him into the ER, and he kept saying, just plug in the ventilator, just plug it in, and I'll be okay. And it seemed like they had to do more, and that's when they discovered he had pneumonia, and then they admitted him. And the next morning he crashed, respiratory crash. And all that week I kept saying to him, Timothy, today is your day of salvation. You need to commit yourself to God. We need to pray. Pray. On Friday night, the doctor said we don't think he's going to make it through the night. And I think I went into shock mode. And I remember telling him, Timothy, this could be your last night. And you need to fight. You need to fight this. Fight for your life like you always had in the past. Fight for your life. And by 6 o'clock the next morning, 6:30, Timothy died. My 24-month short of his 25th birthday died. But then they did the CPR on him. CPR, up and down, up and down. Come on, Timothy. And although they got his heart to beat again, he was no longer my Timothy. He was no longer my Timothy. They put so much IV fluid in him. He couldn't hear, he couldn't see, he couldn't breathe. He couldn't talk. He thought his arm was broken. He had so much fluid in his body. And I kept watching his vital signs, and I kept seeing it go down, down, down. And I'm wondering where my sister is. Why hasn't she gotten here yet? And his vital signs kept going down, down, down. And I realized I was about ready to lose my son again. So I climbed into his hospital bed and I wrapped my arms around him. And I prayed and hoped that he could hear me. Timothy, go with God. You will be at peace. You will be healed. You will be able to run and walk. You will be Timothy. Make sure your heart is ready for that day.